It feels almost redundant to describe how needless an intro to Final Fantasy is needed. The most famous RPG franchise spanning 16 numbered entries and like 100 more spin-offs, sequels, and remakes. Everyone has a different experience with this series, where they entered, which one is their favorite, their least favorite, the overrated, underrated, all of that. I have my own takes on the series, but I don't feel the need to share most of them here. Truthfully, I haven't played that many Final Fantasy games. I've played a couple, but that is nothing compared to the sheer size of the series. And then came along the Pixel remasters not too long ago. Definitive re-releases of the first 6 Final Fantasy games on all modern consoles. The perfect opportunity to go through the series in order with all the modern conveniences we've grown reliant on. So I'm going to discuss this game as an experience in and of itself, then the specifics of the Pixel remaster and my thoughts on that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Final Fantasy opens with a simple party selection screen. You decide on your team composition, then begin the game. I already love this. Job systems are my favourite RPG staple. And while there isn't any swapping around or anything like that during your journey, being able to choose my party from a wider list of options is so fun. Whether you want to build a balanced team or do some crazy low magic build or whatever, you can. The options are delightful. For my first playthrough, I went with a warrior, monk, red mage, and black mage. Then, when I was gathering a little extra footage for this video, I did a monk, thief, white mage, and black mage. At the beginning of the game, a cutscene plays describing how the elements are in disarray, and that a prophecy tells of the 4 warriors of light coming to save the day, using the crystals in hand to restore order. And just like that, we're in the game. We find ourselves right in the center of town with some starting funds. We can buy some equipment, or go talk to the king to begin the story. Obviously, this game is modelled after Dragon Quest. The first Dragon Quest had been out for nearly a year, and the second released just as work on Final Fantasy began. Dragon Quest was the series that set the formula of journeying across the world map from town to town. While Dragon Quest itself is quite directly inspired from other games like Wizardry or Ultima, the similarities between it and Final Fantasy are striking to say the least. But the first big difference is the aforementioned party system. Dragon Quest I had you controlling a lone hero throughout the entire game, and 2 was a party of 3 with quite set-in-stone characteristics that you slowly find. Final Fantasy was the first of the 2 to finally introduce the class system of those older games into the newer home console market. It just barely beat out Wizardry's NES port that arrived literally less than a week later. But we'll talk more about the classes in a moment. First, let's finish this opening. We talk to the king, who assumes us to be the heroes of legend, but they can't be too sure, so they give us a task to prove ourselves. We must journey northwest to defeat the fiend Garland and rescue the king's daughter. So, after just a little bit of grinding and gearing up, we make our way to Garland. He's a relatively easy fight, and after beating him, we return to the king to hand over the princess and begin our true journey, to restore the 4 elemental crystals and save the world. The king orders for the bridge to be restored so we can finally explore the rest of the continent, and we're treated to the ever-iconic story scroll. That's the general start. As basic gets, and I don't mean that as a diss, it's simple and sweet. The real story is found in all these smaller situations each town finds themselves in, whether it's liberating the next town from pirates or rescuing the elf prince who's fallen into an endless slumber. There's lots of classic cliches here, but obviously it isn't fair to fault the game for that. It practically is the mother of most of them. Eventually, the journey culminates into a final confrontation with the creator of the Fiends, in which we discover a devilish time travel plot that helps Chaos live forever in the form of Garland, who we defeated at the beginning of the game. Considering the incredibly simple chosen hero story, the ending is actually pretty subversive, especially for the time. All that being said, the narrative is nothing special. You're not going to be raving to your friends about it, but it more than accomplishes the job it set out to do. It is a good motivating force keeping the world interesting along your quest. Now let's get into the gameplay, starting with those jobs. There's 6 in total, so you're always leaving out 2. They all serve pretty simple and clear roles, 3 melee attackers, 3 magic users. They are certainly varied enough to keep the game feeling fresh on any replay, but of course, it's not an in-depth system. Your class affects your stats, what equipment you can use, which spells you can learn, and if you're able to learn spells at all. You can feel the beginnings of a better system here. The only real choice you get once the game is started is which spells you acquire and what gear you equip. But this brings us to the spell system, which is one of my favourite aspects of Final Fantasy I. Borrowing heavily from Dungeons & Dragons, spells are grouped into separate tiers. You can only have 3 spells per tier, so picking which 3 you keep with you is one of the biggest choices you make in the game. There are 64 in total, 32 white spells and 32 black spells. The first pertains to supportive or holy magic, while the other is reserved for like debuffs and DPS. There are 8 tiers and 4 available spells each tier. You simply buy them from shops you find in towns. As your mage levels up, you gain more usages of each spell, so you might have like 7 uses of level 1 magic, 4 uses of level 2, and just 1 level 3 spell to use. They get restored each time you sleep at either an inn or you camp. I really like this system. It gives you a reason to use lesser magic, as it doesn't decrease or take away from your available stronger magic. Rather than just depleting different amounts of mana, no matter how many fire spells you use, it won't change how many Thundara spells you use in the next fight. You really engage with the entire magic system differently. I think it's a massive shame this style was holistically abandoned by the rest of the series, and even the broader RPG genre as a whole. I think nearly every remake of Final Fantasy I changed it to the MP system until the Pixel Remaster. There is quite a bit of depth in the magic users. White mages use all kinds of white magic, and black mages vice versa. The red mage can use a little bit of both. Unfortunately, the melee classes are a bit boring. You have warriors, monks, and thieves. Each do offer different benefits, but for the entire game, they will basically only be using normal attacks, which is the biggest problem with these older RPGs. Besides equipment, which can offer some fun decision making, melee classes are just so simple. You just spam the normal attack over and over. Obviously, the thief can use a steal command, which is mildly helpful, but unless you have a guide with the times you should steal, it kind of feels like a wasted turn, so either you religiously follow a guide, or you waste a lot of turns stealing. This kind of thing is where the cracks show with older RPGs. There just kinda isn't enough to chew on. But you won't be chewing for very long, as these older games end up being really short. I think that's a great thing, honestly. The original took about 20 to 30 hours to complete, and with the modern conveniences of the Pixel Remaster, that drops even more, cutting out all the grinding and monotony to like a nice 10 or 15 hours. I think it's perfectly ideal for this sort of thing. It doesn't outstay its welcome when it's over so quickly. Progress is fast, so you never feel stuck doing the same thing over and over. The game gradually opens up as you explore. You start on a single continent, then unlock a boat to travel the seas and an airship to travel the skies. Classic stuff. You also find a magic key, which unlocks various doors throughout the world, in both new locations and old ones. This is another mechanic taken right from Dragon Quest, and it works well here. You're constantly on the move, finding the next location, looking for towns you haven't been to, things like that, and the key offers a fun reason to backtrack if you'd like, but there's literally like no obligation. Exploration is great in this game, though where it suffers a bit more is the dungeons. The layouts are never bad, but they're really bland. Again, I think it would be unfair to expect much more from a game of this era, but it also feels dishonest to pretend like they aren't a little bare bones. Just something to be aware of, I guess. I did find the bosses to be quite engaging. There aren't a million unique mechanics, but they aren't just bullet sponges either. Different weaknesses and resistances to discover, each of them having different movesets as well. You can really learn them and figure out the best way to deal with them, usually through your spells or equipment. So there's still always the highlight of any weaker dungeon. I think overall, while some of the locations to explore may be a bit dull, and the systems don't give you too much to play with, it's still surprising how big this older game is. There's so much to discover, the battles are still somewhat fun, and the job system is a big highlight that really adds a lot of depth to the experience even all these years later. So I think that's really all I have to say about the game. I think it's a worthy experience to have. Understanding the history of this genre really helps me appreciate it that much more. So going back to play this was really fun, even if it feels all overly simple compared to the complexity of later titles. But now we can dive into the Pixel Remaster, which is an endlessly interesting topic. So the first Final Fantasy has been remade and re-released a lot of times, from different regions with patches to the Game Boy Advance, PSP, and even mobile phones. Usually in situations like this, the original holds a special place as one of the best, mostly due to its authenticity, as opposed to whichever version is considered definitive. But the original Final Fantasy was thrown together incredibly quickly. It had a famously tough and short development time, so the game is piled full with bugs and issues. Most descriptions of equipment just lie and don't change anything. All sorts of weapons that are supposed to be effective to different monster types are completely the same. There are a million glitches. Even the wisdom stat is completely broken, as it's never used in a single calculation in the entire game. So disregarding hacks that do fix these problems, the original is a pretty divisive release. Now I think the Pixel Remaster is the best way to play this game. Firstly, let's discuss its art style. I really like it, taking inspiration from like almost every edition together. The main cast are finally based again on their NES designs, which most of the other versions did change. But the NPCs and the like are quite similar to the Game Boy Advance release. I think it's a really lovely way to do up this old game without making it look too new. I feel that everyone is turning against HD 2D right now, which I mostly agree with. The art style is just far too intense and is distracting more than attractive in most cases, but this still tastefully maintains the pixels, while still being prettied up for the new generation. Even if you hate this style, I think there is something else incredibly important to mention. They brought back the original games artist, Kazuko Shibuya. She's responsible for so much of the series' visual identity and was the primary pixel artist for basically every 2D Final Fantasy game. I think the art is so much more impactful with the knowledge that she had the opportunity to come back and revise her own work from the modern day, not just some external meddling designed to be best for newer audiences. Now let's come to the gameplay changes. There aren't too many. Most of the original game's pacing and gameplay is kept very similar. Same spells, same equipment, same shops, same baddies. The gameplay changes are mostly in external settings and quality of life changes. Not really actual additions to the content itself, which I think is pretty smart for a remaster like this. Now with those quality of life changes, there's a tough conversation to have. I really love a lot of these, but I feel they can become a double-edged sword. Here's an example. You can adjust the amount of EXP and gil you get at the end of each fight. You can up it or even lower it, however much you like. This is one of the best ways to improve some older RPGs that are reliant on grinding to pad content. But personally, when features like this are added, I would also like to make the enemies harder, so I have to fight fewer enemies for a lot of XP, but they're tough battles. That isn't an option here, but that doesn't mean it's bad on its own. The bigger issue is that double-edged sword effect I mentioned earlier. You can adjust the numbers to your liking until the game feels good to you, but you have to resist the temptation to just increase everything. If you do max it out and get bored, it's your own fault. That's the risk you get when there are mechanics like this included. You have the option to turn off random encounters with just the click of the right stick. It feels great. Those long and boring dungeons I complained about earlier are made so much better when you aren't interrupted by the same enemies every 2 steps. But then the desire to just leave them off for a bit longer comes in. Then you up the XP for the few fights you do actually do, and you become overleveled, without ever really experiencing the challenge of slowly dwindling resources and winding tunnels. I'm mixed on the outcome, but I will absolutely say I think it's better that they're here than if they weren't. I use them a lot, and I think my enjoyment of this game was significantly improved because of it. It's just a complicated question to ask. Now, this applies to basically every remaster of old RPGs, not just the Pixel Remaster. And I think the Pixel Remaster is one of the better examples of how to execute all of this. It's elegant, simple, and easy to use. There are maps of the areas you're in. Shops are labelled more clearly in towns. You can tell how many chests there are in each dungeon and how many you haven't collected. It's all great and just smooths over those rough edges, for better or worse. One weird little gripe I have is that for some reason the church isn't shown on the minimap. Every other type of building is, but the church is just some random building you have to stumble upon. It's usually pretty easy to find. They were designed to be found like that in the original. It just feels so weird, though it's a minor issue to be clear. Finally, I think this is worth mentioning. When these first came out, there was a big complaint everyone had, me included, was the terrible font. It was far too narrow and barely filled the text boxes. It was ugly and hard to read. But it's been patched out of basically every modern version. I played on Switch, and as you can see by the footage here, the font is perfectly fine. It fits the aesthetic and is reasonable. Overall, I think it feels great to have this original game maintained and embellished like this. It's the first time the original Final Fantasy I is available with its unique magic system. Everything works without the annoying bugs, and it's fairly cheap and beautifully done. I find it hard to complain about a product like this. And those are my thoughts on these remasters. I want to keep playing through the 2D Final Fantasy games and probably review them here, but I won't be going over the pixel remaster as a broad concept each and every time, so this is basically it. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about this game. Stick around if you want to hear more.